We have approximately 90 minutes assigned to this webinar. So let me come straight to the issue. COVID-19 is currently disrupting business operations across the globe. Building confidence and trust in business to respond to regulatory and contractual requirements will be critical differentiator as corporations respond to and rise from global disruption. While cyber risk is an important consideration in resilience planning, companies have long maintained various risk mitigating plans for business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management. While effective for a range of business disruptions, may fall short during a global crisis such as coronavirus or other pandemic events. Security monitoring centers in COVID-19 affected areas have been shut down, rendering several companies exposed. Many such companies have been hit by cyber attacks comprising sensitive data. Further, cyber criminals disguising WHO representatives are sending fake COVID-19 email updates to bait users and steal confidential information. We are indeed in a time of great uncertainty. As the event evolves, we are seeing companies take measured approaches to safeguard employees and mitigate financial and cyber, more importantly, the reputational exposure. There is a huge need felt to invest in technology and infrastructure to support remote work and virtual collaboration capabilities. A pandemic requires employees to stay home to limit exposure and to prevent or slow down the spread of the disease, requiring activation of remote working capabilities. This may in turn result in heavier than normal traffic on remote connectivity networks or capacity and local access issues. The increase in remote working and multiple internet updates seeking of information by organizations could lead to avenues for fraudsters to target organizations and their employees to hand over their credentials and get unregulated access to the business accounts and network of the organization. As companies have stipulated work from home, a spike in ransomware attacks could be possible. The servers, remote computers could be attacked and encrypted for ransom, bringing entities to a complete standstill. Use of personal devices, unsecured networks, and unencrypted email accounts are more prone to data breaches and cyber frauds. So the key questions to ponder on today in view of COVID-19 are: have you stress tested the ability of critical service providers such as cloud, backup services, or security providers to support business during a disruption? How are you monitoring your information technology systems disruptions? How secure is your system from cyber attacks? Have all your employees been adequately trained for cyber security? Are there statutory, regulatory, or contractual restrictions on any data collection, processing, or dissemination contemplated to address COVID-19 risks? Are you sufficiently cyber insured? Is a privacy assessment or a security risk assessment required for any new data related activity? And what confidentiality or other privacy considerations should be kept in mind while identifying clients, employees, third parties, public or governmental authorities? To deliberate on our important issues and answer your queries, we have three experts from KPMG with us. Mr. Akhilesh Tuteja. Akhilesh serves as the Global Cybersecurity Practice Co-Leader and heads the IT Advisory Practice for KPMG India. He also heads the Risk Consulting Practice for KPMG in India. Akhilesh is passionate about developments in the area of information technology and has also played an active part in developing security and privacy frameworks for the banking industry in India. Mr. David Farbrash, I hope the pronunciation is correct. David is Global Head of Cyber Futures KPMG in the UK, has over 30 years of cyber and information security expertise. David leads the thought leadership and innovation programs for the firm and is also coordinating global cyber response to COVID-19. David is a fellow of British Computer Society and was awarded an OBE for his services to the national security post 9/11. Prior to joining KPMG, David was the head of cyber and space for the Ministry of Defense in UK. Joining Akhilesh and David is Mr. Atul Gupta. Atul is partner with Advisory Services, KPMG India, and leads cybersecurity services. He has an enriched experience in the IT advisory assignments and has extensive cyber and information security experience, along with focus on IT governance, technical security, IT auditing, and large IT projects management. Thank you, Akhilesh, David, and Atul for your time and for joining this webinar on cybersecurity and data privacy. Before I hand over, we'll take half a minute more, and this is for the participants. KPMG team will make a presentation for around 40-45 minutes and then take up your questions. We have received few questions already, and same will be answered first after the presentation. Then further questions will be taken, and you may ask by raising hand. So with these opening remarks, I welcome you all once again. And may I now request Akhilesh to take over and lead the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikas, for that lovely introduction, and pleased to be here on this panel today talking about a very, very important subject, which is on cybersecurity and data privacy. Before I get into the presentation, just a request to the event team, if we could quickly run 2 poll questions. Those are the questions just to get a sense of the audience profile. Will help us tailor our conversation in the right manner. So if you are in front of your screen, we will see 2 questions. First question is, which industry do you belong to? You could pick one from the several, and if you don't find your industry listed, go for other, and that should give us some idea. The second question is, what organizational function are you part of? Is it information technology, cybersecurity, human resource, or any other? And if you don't find a function which you represent, click other. So we've got few seconds for you to answer this poll question. And once you answer this poll question, we will be able to get to a decent idea of what the kind of people we are here so that we can tailor our discussion. As you can understand, this topic is extremely wide. We can go into a number of areas, but we would like to tailor the content based on the audience we have here. So with that, let me just take you through a few contextual points before I engage into a conversation with 2 of my wonderful colleagues, David and Atul, which Vikas briefly introduced, have a plethora of expertise and a wide range of experience working across industries and for several decades. Next slide, please. If we look at our world of cybersecurity is going through a very different point of view right now, given what's happening in our world. So this is a chart based on all the public data available, based on how each of the countries is dealing with the crisis created by COVID-19. So there are some points which I want to pick up from here. One clearly is that there is no country yet which has been able to reverse the trend. So while we see some of these trends getting flattened, we haven't seen any trends are getting reversed. So as you can see, that the scale on the y-axis is not a linear scale, it's an exponential scale. So every increase in this is a 10x improvement on the number of cases. The interesting topic you will see here is that India seems to have done a very good job of having locked people down at an early stage. So you can see the x-axis around 32 or 33 days from the first outbreak. India has been a complete lockdown, and you will see a different trend for countries like US and others who potentially did a different kind of strategy. So I think this does tell us that protection is better than cure in this situation because there isn't really a cure. And I want to pick this view from here. When we're dealing with the subject of cybersecurity and data privacy, protection is far more important than dealing with the response. And this is how we see our world moving forward. It is very hard to predict where we will go. But if you see on the next slide, you will find a very interesting depiction, and I borrowed this slide from a blog writer to basically say how people in their own individual world, in our own lives, are living through different stages of evolution with respect to what we have done with respect to the COVID-19 situation. So as you see in the next slide, we believe that there are going to be 5 stages, and those 5 stages would range from preparation phase, which will move very quickly into the stress phase, and the stress phase in our view lies around 1 to 2 months. And once we are done with the stress and we know how it is going to span, that will then create a survival stage. And survival stage hopefully will last no more than 3 to 4 months, but we believe the story is unlikely to be over by then, and that it might lead us to an extended impact depending upon how we provide this response. And hopefully, after all that, we will get into a recovery phase and we will see different change. So as you can see, there are different activities which are happening and which will happen in each of the phases. So the initial preparation phase was invoking of the crisis management plan, creating contingency planning, re-engineering how we access our workplaces, and preparation for work from home. The stress phase, which I think we're right now in most parts of the world dealing with, about how do you manage working capital, how do you reduce the kind of people who you don't need, and how do you make sure that the remote working becomes a reality. Many countries, and now India also, is getting into a phase of survival where we've understood that just panicking isn't enough. And therefore, we are seeing a strategic focus by organizations on reducing operating costs, creating some kind of redundancies, and also dealing with the supply chain disruption. And hopefully, as we go further towards recovery, we will improvise our plan. But if you go on to the next slide, you will see a very similar depiction of the same thing happening in our personal life. So in our personal lives too, as it is in the organization life, it is all starting with the phase one, which is the stage of fear. And stage of fear basically is when you first time hear about something which is so incredibly far out there, something which you have never dealt before, high degree of anxiety. So clearly, people have started to overbuy, and things like candles, toilet paper in many parts of the world went out of the shelf in a very, very short period of time. But also, a lot of people became anxious and more complained. Lot of addiction got created with consuming news whichever way it came. So the amount of trigger happy news and amount of information which got consumed by the people in the early stages of fear was unprecedented. And I want to make this point here because in the subsequent slides, we will talk about how our desire and how our need for more information and more accurate information, more real-time information is actually creating a significant cyber risk for us. Of course, once you go over the stage of fear in a few weeks, you get into a stage of learning where you try and you try and minimize your exposure to the news because nothing changes every minute. You also try and overcome some of these harmful addiction by consuming more food and more news, and hopefully control your weight a little bit more. And also, once you have lived through the stage of learning, there's a stage of growth. And I think that's something which we will get there very soon. And there you try and use your skills to benefit others. You use your skills and capabilities and empathy and compassion to help others. So I think in our real world, we have started to live that point where we are working for our broader communities. Every one of us, in whatever capacity, are contributing financially, non-financially, and many other ways to support those who need more support in today's time. So these are the 3 stages of things which we as humans are going through right now. But what does it all mean for our business? And that I will talk about on the next slide. If you look at it from a business standpoint, there's clearly losses. Irrespective of what we may do or what we may not do, we will see significant losses the businesses will suffer. We have seen from the previous crises, it could be either the Great Depression or even the crisis like 2008 financial crisis, we saw every sector of the economy gets hurt and there are losses. And sometimes it takes as much as 3 to 4 and sometimes 5 years for certain sectors to come back to where they were. So clearly we are going to see losses in this crisis as well. But what's worrying is that we are seeing a higher degree of uncertainty than what we have seen in any other crisis because the end is not in sight and there's also significant uncertainty about how it will play out once the restrictions around movement of people, etc., go away. There is some sense of hope from early adoption of what we are seeing easing up of people movement in China and some other parts of the world where we saw an early outbreak of the disease, there are some positive signs for us to look at. But what it clearly means is that every business I'm talking to, they are looking at this as a reset opportunity. We are looking at doing business in a very different manner. How many people have already started to believe that they don't need so much of real estate to run the business anymore? We don't need everybody to come to office every single day. People are realizing that there is a lot of work which can be done digitally, remotely, and therefore you don't need to be face to face. The amount of digital technology adoption which is happening during this time has never happened before. The number of self-service tools which had a very high resistance and change resistance are now getting adopted at a very, very easy pace. So clearly we are seeing that there is a new reset and a new normal this world has created. If you go on to the next slide, I just want to talk to you about a very simple yet a very powerful story here. And this is the story of how we've changed our lives using video collaboration technologies. And the one which we are right now in talking and conversing and consuming this content. There was a time when video collaboration technologies were created, and many of them were ahead of its time. We did not have infrastructure. We did not have the culture of meeting people on virtual mediums, and therefore the growth of this technology was rather slow. But one big event like COVID-19 changed the game quite dramatically. The adoption of video collaboration technologies, both in our personal lives as well as in our business execution, has gone through the roof. If I were to talk about just one of the video collaboration technologies, which has been talked about quite a lot, they saw their adoption from 1x to 20x in a period of 6 weeks. So the number of users which they had almost multiplied by 20 times in less than 6 weeks. And that really resulted in a great growth for the company, not just in the number of users, but also in terms of the stock price. Now, if you look at on the next slide, this is a depiction of that company's stock price. And as you can see, between, let's say, uh, December to March, there was a steady increase in the stock price of the company because the number of users is just growing. And only a small cybersecurity issue which got highlighted and highlighted very widely in social media, in public domain, and in others. And suddenly the company saw a significant reduction in the active users, and that really translated into significant reduction in the stock price and market capitalization. So a company which grew on the back of a trend also started to see significant fears of going down because of a similar trend continuing, but it having an issue to deal with is on cybersecurity. But I do want to also highlight the company was very, very proactive in terms of dealing with some of those issues. And within a period of 1 week, all those issues which were identified and highlighted as big security issues were actually addressed. And the company's stock price has come back and possibly at an even slightly higher point than where it was in a matter of 2 weeks. So the point I'm trying to make that irrespective of the situation or the kind of business you are in, cybersecurity matters. So if you are a business, whether you are a business which is digitally dependent or using technology in any shape or form, you cannot afford to have a cybersecurity issue. So in today's world, and my colleague David will talk about it, cybersecurity has become one of the most foundational trust driver for businesses. People realize that it is important to invest in branding, but it is more important to invest in cybersecurity because brand brings loyalty and the cybersecurity also creates stickiness. It not only increases your customers, but also increases the enterprise value. So cybersecurity is one of the big drivers for driving digital trust as well as customer loyalty and stickiness. So I do want to highlight to you, if many of you who are part of the cybersecurity businesses or responsible for managing cybersecurity business, you must know that you are in a very good shape because this is the time for all of us to believe that even though the world is not normal, even though we are taking lots of different kinds of shortcuts, but the world of cybersecurity is extremely important. So I would say that if you haven't invested enough in cybersecurity, definitely this is the time to do it. But if you have done it, continue to do that because this will be an important area. For those of you who are cybersecurity experts, I think this is our time because never before there has been a and demand for cybersecurity talent so much higher. So in today's world, the two things that are growing more than anything else is one is consumption of cloud, and the second is consumption of cybersecurity. So these are the two things. Now, what I would like to do is that in the interest of time, we cannot cover everything which is relevant in the world of cybersecurity to our businesses. We picked up 5 themes, and these are the themes based on our analysis as well as the feedback which we received through the questions. So we will talk about the 5 themes today. One is how COVID-19 has created a higher propensity for cybercrime and fraud. What does senior management and board need to do in today's time to be on the right side of cybersecurity? And the third one is how important is it for us to change the posture when we deal with cybersecurity in work from home environment? And then very important tool, which sometimes gets missed, is cyber insurance. And fifth is how do we deal with the data privacy? While there was a regulation which is around the corner in India and has been implemented in many parts of the world, but even while we deal with this COVID-19 time, how do we manage that? So let me, at this point, invite my colleague Atul, who runs the cybersecurity consulting business for KPMG in India, to take us through the theme relating to how is this current environment leading to higher cybercrime and fraud.
Thank you, Akhilesh, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be having this conversation. And as was talked upon, I'll get started with looking at the cybercrime and the fraud. So that's one big theme which very clearly emerged upon. And if we move on to the next page, you'll get to see how the attackers have been able to keep pace with the way the entire situation in the world has been changing upon. And it's very interesting to observe and very fairly well covered upon over a period of time, saying that the attackers have been bringing upon cyber specific attacks or cyber specific crimes which were very contextual, which were very topical, which were very relevant from the situation which everyone was going through. In the initial part, Akhilesh did cover upon on uncertainty, which was one of the key drivers for everyone to deal with the pandemic scenario. And that's when a lot of individuals were accessing internet to get more and more information about the pandemics. And if you really see some of the leading or initial indicators which emerged upon from the cyber attackers were where they were either masquerading as health organizations, global health organizations, or when the maps were becoming very popular just to see how the spread of coronavirus is impacting various regions of the world. There were Trojans and malwares which were being put across on those maps, said that while people get information, but those can also result into attacks and the new threat vectors which can be established upon. In addition, as there were a spate of linkages on government benefits, tax benefits, and so on and so forth, which various states and countries started going through, we started to see that attackers were fairly agile in adopting those mechanisms as well to launch upon cyber attacks, and so on and so forth. It just kept on continuing. What really it brings upon is that the people who are operating today in a new way of working, which we are not so familiar with working upon, are getting subjected to various forms of attacks, which may be in form of either a ransomware attack, it may be in form of a credential theft being taken upon from the individual. It may be either in form of the email attacks, which was the business email compromise and the relevant frauds which are coming upon. And in many cases, it has also become a cryptocurrency related frauds, where the processing power is being used upon for generating the crypto, the mining is being done using those processors which are available, and so on and so forth. It's a real double whammy because the citizens of the country, while they were dealing upon with this uncertainty, many of them also got subjected upon to the cyber crime and fraudulent practices, which went along with the curve that Akhilesh showcased upon. There have been reports which have emerged within the country that this is not something which is one-off, or it is something which is only limited to a particular state within the country. It was kind of spread very uniformly across the country. In fact, there have been guidelines which have emerged upon from the right authorities within the country also on how new operating mechanisms should be looked upon. So if we move to the next slide, we'll get to see some of the drivers which really have caused upon these attacks to grow. I did talk upon on uncertainty, and that was one of the key reasons for everyone to go out and seek more and more information. And that became one of the key ways for the threat to really go ahead, which was as and when people were accessing those information points, could bring upon something which was not the bona fide application or bona fide source, but a malified source, which was resulting in all these issues to come across. This was obviously looked upon in areas which were more attractive to the consumers, consumer goods definitely being there, one of those. A very, very famous attack which happened not in the country, but it happened in Canada is a store by name, the beer store. And the beer store was completely down because of a cyber attack which happened during this period. And apparently they had to run the stores with running only cash-based transactions rather than electronic transactions. And in today's environment, where we all know that ability to go out and have cash-based transactions is so limited, it had a direct bearing on the implications or from the business orientation perspective. The other one which has very clearly re-emerged is a spate of ransomware, which is also very closely linked upon because a lot of organizations, enterprises, as well as people had to completely reorient the way in which they were operating using digital technologies. And those digital technologies were coming at a pace which many of them may not have witnessed in past, or they were comfortable in adopting the pace. But because the nature of the incident or the nature of pandemic was forcing people to get into that kind of an operating environment, that became an opportunity for attackers to launch in ransomware attacks. We have seen a spate of ransomware attacks which have gone up during this period. It's become a big challenge for enterprises to deal with it. And many of those have got linked very closely to having built upon the new operating mechanisms, which was in form of work from home environments, which were to be provided upon. So those are some of the key trends which we are getting to see why the cyber frauds or where are the cyber crimes really emerging from. But if we move forward to the next page or the next slide, it really gives us an indication saying what should be done. What does it mean? Because this is the new normal. This is the way we are going to coexist or co-live as we move forward from here. The way of digital operating mechanisms will become a reality. It's already a reality, and going forward, it will become even a bigger reality from here. It means enterprises, organizations need to factor in an adversary on a cyber crime or a fraudulent transactions to happen emerging from this channel. We very clearly see three areas which need to be focused upon. The first one is ensuring that advisories are provided upon to all the users. We believe at times things are very simple, very logical, but in the situations when people are stressed, people are dealing with uncertainties, simplest advisory really goes a long way in ensuring that the people can be more cognizant when they are dealing with digital technologies, and thereby resulting in lesser cyber crimes or fraudulent activities to happen upon. The second area which we very clearly see is there is a need to establish communication channels. So while advisories are more as an input which comes into the users, but having right communication channels, which is more two-way communication channels, is also a key area which enterprises and organizations will need to establish upon, because there could be multiple queries, multiple areas which people would like to clarify on. And establishing those channels can go a long way in ensuring those queries get addressed or those good practices could be shared upon as and when an individual comes across those situations to avoid the cyber frauds or looking upon from a cyber crime perspective. And the last but not the least, which we always talk upon, is saying in a digital environment, trusting is obviously having a big challenge because it's so easy to masquerade identity, it's so easy to come across in a virtual world in a very deceptive manner. And that's where the focus really needs to be driven upon saying that how the workforce, as they operate in this new environment, they need to really apply what to trust and what not to, or bring upon the caution element to look upon on the trust factor which really emerges. I know in the previous section, reference on one of those channels which was being quite actively used upon, and there were issues with respect to security, and largely it also got attributed to the levels of awareness which was there within the workforce that was operating upon, and using those collaborative channels or using those collaborative platforms where there was a wave of or there was a complete wave of adoption which happened without looking at saying whether we are taking upon things which are trusted, or we're just following upon some of the elements which are being shared upon with us. And I think that that will be really a very important and a big change which we'll have to bring upon in this new operating environment, where trust along with caution will become the new norm as we move forward from here. So those were some of the key perspectives which I wanted to share upon from a cyber crime and a cyber fraud perspective. Moving on to the second theme, I'll invite David to talk upon, which is focused on the boards and the senior management.
So thank you for that, Atul. And I think you picked up on the trust piece for me, which actually I think is key to this going forward. So if I looked at it from a board and senior management perspective, most of the clients we've been involved in have gone through some massive changes and transformations in their working practices, driven very, very aggressively over the last 2 months. So the move to home working at scale has been transformational for many organizations, and even for KPMG itself, where we've rolled out Microsoft Teams globally in a program that would have taken us traditionally 18 months in the space of 2 to 3 months. So, and in doing that, I think, let's be honest, I mean, firms have taken risk just now. We've had to adopt new collaborative working platforms, new cloud-based solutions, new video and audio conferencing platforms as well. And all of that done at pace just now. So what I'm beginning to see now is certainly the risk teams in many of the organizations I deal with are now saying, now is the time to stabilize. Now is the time to begin to catch up on what you might describe almost as the security debt, where we've been pragmatic, we've had to lash systems together in very short order sometimes, and we've exposed ourselves to a degree of risk in doing that. And we've seen, as Atul's hinted at, the cybercrime landscape has changed with a bigger focus on COVID-19 and coronavirus-themed campaigns. So what I think we're now seeing is boards are beginning to realize that cybersecurity is a key consideration to maintain going forward. And they're beginning to say, how can I engineer my security and in some cases my fraud controls around what is now a very different working model for me? And I'll touch on a couple of pieces I've seen from clients around that. I think there is a message there that says cybersecurity is still critical. If anything, the cyber threat has remained broadly similar in terms of volume, but what has changed is those lures, those phishing emails around COVID-19 and coronavirus are very convincing, and in this period of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, people are clicking on those. And also the home working control environment that we've had to create sometimes is more susceptible to ransomware and other compromises than our carefully controlled corporate IT environment. So we saw one survey done recently by BitSight actually that said the prevalence, the frequency of ransomware in home networks is about 3.5 times what we would conventionally see in corporate just now. So it matters to get this security right now and to catch up on some of that debt. So we are seeing people support cyber investments. We're also seeing some opportunities with the move to cloud to actually sometimes improve the controls environment as you do that as well. So where security works well with the CIO team and goes with the pragmatism that the business needs to survive, it's actually working quite well just now, actually, and that's positive. So my other point around fraud control is traditionally we have a range of fraud controls which operate around things like call centers, and they assume the physical location of people, oversight, supervision. As we move call centers to remote working, we've had to re-engineer some of those control measures because we're seeing different patterns of fraud. The analytics we used previously aren't picking up on some of the issues for us, so we've had to tweak and adapt those as well. We've also seen something else. This, for many firms, is the first time they've had to deal with a gold level crisis at executive level, which impacts the whole of the organization as well. They've had to organize HR, communications, massive IT upgrades and investments, changes in working models, agree where they're going to take risk and short notice with the CROs as well. All of that's required a crisis response. And it's also pointed out a number of potential concerns as well around things like supply chain vulnerabilities and weaknesses, as the supply chain is really suffering from both international lockdowns in terms of transit of goods and cargoes, but also the issues it's seeing around the liquidity of some of those key suppliers and them facing their own changes in working practices and models. So resilience matters. And for me, I think you can break it down into 6 main categories. But there's issues around the workforce management where we've seen firms move away from the idea of a single key person risk to talk about if I saw 20 or 30% absenteeism across my organization, or even whole teams who are out because of self-isolation for COVID-19, how can I deal with and adapt to that? So it's making people think more holistically about the way the organization survives and the resilience measures. It's certainly making us think very differently about technology and how we harness that and secure it, and that's a good thing. And I've already touched on supply chain resilience, and we're going to see more of that during the extended recovery period from COVID-19. This is not a quick lockdown lifts. It's going to be a period of disruption to supply chains running 6, 12, 18 months out, partly from travel restrictions, partly from liquidity and capital issues in those supply chains. So that's forcing us to think about what are our critical dependencies and how do we manage those, and where might we have alternative sources for some key services as well. And we touched on cybersecurity already. It's not gone away as an issue, but there are actually some opportunities to embed cybersecurity into those new working models if we get it right for cloud, for digital channels. And the last couple of points for me, we are obviously having to think very differently about the way we manage our facilities just now, the need for physical sites, the way we do split working between A and B shifts to minimize the risk of infection and cross-contamination, and the hygiene measures we put in place. All of that's being worked through across many nations now as we all go through that process of incrementally returning to some sort of new normality in our lives. And that's very different. And that middle one is the one I'll finish on, which is robust crisis communication really, really matters. It plays to Atul's point, transparency, clear communication, consistency, internal and external messaging. And that reduces the fear, uncertainty, and doubt which organized crime groups are using to get people to compromise the systems and services by clicking on those phishing links. And that's something Aklesh is going to talk a little bit about with some pragmatic advice on working from home.
Thanks, David. Before I come on to this working from home and some of these interesting points, I just want to ask you a question. Is as the businesses are going through significant uncertainty and there is a high degree of anxiety to reduce costs so that one can stay profitable over long term, how are you seeing that impacting the investment in cybersecurity? Are people kind of looking at that with the same lens as they're possibly looking at the other budget? And what should be the advice for people in today's time?
Okay, so the answer is yes, it's under pressure. And it depends how you look at cybersecurity, to be honest, Aklesh. If you just see it as a risk reduction measure and a cost overhead, then the answer is yes, of course, everybody's under pressure because we're going to see major budgetary pressures in quite a few sectors. Oil and gas would be the extreme example. So in that case, security is going to be pushed. They're going to try and defend themselves and say, well, the cyber threat is still here. But I think they'll be forced to rationalize, to automate processes, to reduce manpower, to think about new delivery models, even for security. But I think the more successful strategy is not just to see security as a cost overhead, but actually see it as a key part of enabling the new working model. And it's two sides of the coin. The CIO is having to fundamentally change the working model, new technology platforms, new home working, and the security investment actually is the flip side of that coin just now. And if you portray it that way, I think it actually works a lot better than just being seen as a risk management, a cost overhead, at which point the outcome is going to be a 20 or 30% savings measure imposed.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very good practical advice. Let me take on to this work from home and what's really changing our world around that. So the first thing I would say is work from home for most people who felt was a great thing are thinking otherwise. Because most people felt that going to office was a bit of burden, but I think there will be a group of people who would believe that when this whole lockdown is over, they would like to take a few days break and actually spend some time in office. So I think I'm seeing that cult of people growing that who want to take a break from home. I hope my family is not listening to that, but I think it's good to have a bit of change. But as we work from home, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, a higher degree of hygiene is must and it's required. And as I'm advising to some of my clients to say that this is the time for the clients to also invest a little bit more in kinds of things they did not do, because when we were on uh, work from office, we had a great advantage of a secure perimeter. So when you're in office, there's some basic things taken care of. There's a physical access control, there's also network perimeter and all that. But when everybody is working from home, two, three interesting challenges come up. One, there is no perimeter, either physical or network. And two, we don't have the same degree of controls being applicable, which can be pushed from the network at all times. Because if you don't switch off your computer, if you don't restart, some of the policies don't get pushed. And if you don't have scheduled tasks to update your policies, your computer may be more at risk than it's been while working in office. Also, this sudden work from home has also pushed some of these less secure devices to be connected to the network. And I know many of my clients have also put some of these password policy at the less stringent level of application. So typically the password which used to expire every 45 or 60 days have now been pushed to 90 or 120 days. The complexity of passwords have been reduced because then it allows people to make simple password and not lock themselves down all the time. So I think we have made some, if I were to use the word, shortcut for convenience, and therefore we need to compensate with a higher degree of cyber hygiene. So first, very important is that many devices which were not traveling devices like the desktops, which are now being accessed from home, they need to be encrypted. I know many laptops are already encrypted, but if they're not, I think encryption is must, because the ability for a device to get lost while in transit or while not in a controlled environment is higher. And if you're not encrypted, then that I think creates a big risk to the organization. And in the context of data privacy, and as we start to have data privacy law in most parts of the world and India law around the corner, the liabilities are quite high if you lose a device which has data which is not encrypted. So I think getting a data encrypted while in store is quite important. Then getting to have the right kind of antivirus and DLP checks is very important, because when we were working in office, some of those policies were already updated and one didn't have to worry about it. But now I think one has to be a little bit extra careful in making sure that those policies still updated. There are new services which can run because all the time people may be, while working from home, getting into some of these other parallel activities which might bring in some additional risk. Use of USBs has been one of the biggest challenges beyond the human side of the security. So I would caution everybody to be super careful using USBs. And when you have multiple people within the same home working, so the way we are maintaining the social distance, I think I would request social distance between a USB stick and a computer will go a long way in keeping your computer healthy. And also making sure that we connect with VPN and have right kind of access control and creating high degree of logging and auditing of workflows to do are some of these hygiene which I will talk about. But if we move to the next slide, I will talk about some of the things which are important if work from home becomes the way of life in the long-term future, and as we are calling it, the new normal. So what I talked about in the previous one were more like, the immediate tactical steps, but these are some of these very important steps which the companies must invest in. So one is clearly to have a stronger identity and access management. Because when you are in the perimeter, you can be okay with less stronger access management and identity control. But when people are distributed, working from anywhere and everywhere, the device level identity, the human level identity, and all of that needs to get orchestrated much more stronger. The second thing is about BYOD. We like it or not, there is going to be more BYOD. In fact, somebody told me that it's no longer BYOD. It is TYH2 or something. It basically says that take your device home. So when you have your take your device home, you need to apply some higher degree of controls around that, and then you become responsible for maintaining security in a longer period of time. And the companies are adopting newer methods of how do they check the health of these machines while they're not connected to the network at all times. I would say this new normal where people are working from home has made some good strides. Number of executives who used to be substantially dependent on their assistants or on IT staff have learned to adopt a new way of working themselves. So now the time has come when even the CEOs are doing things which they never did because now you don't have a choice and you can't delegate it to somebody else. So the self-use technology, the self-service technology is growing very fast. What it is also creating is that it is actually multiplying the shadow IT or cloud stuff in a big way. So if you are an enterprise IT person, it's your responsibility. How do you reduce that proliferation, or even if that increases, how do you govern those things is very important. Needless to say, collaboration platforms have seen another surge. So tools like MS Teams and many others are becoming very, very powerful, and their usage is going through the roof. It is also very important that those tools don't get deployed simply in an unsecure or conditional manner. There are security guidelines around that. So when people use collaboration platform, there's a need to be a lot more conscious. And again, combined with identity management, a good configuration of the collaboration platform can make the enterprise safe in the long run. I think both Atul and David talked about the need for resilience in the business, in technology, but I think it's equally important to build a resilient IT or technology architecture. Cloud comes at the center of it, which I think most people are now realizing the importance. But beyond cloud, how do you make sure that an architecture which can work across? But also being very important that while you build resilient architecture, do not bypass some of the regulatory requirements, because there are also regulatory considerations about what kind of data can be stored where, and how do you have control over the legitimate use of storage of data. So it's very important to have a good resilient architecture in addition with information governance model. Last but not the least, because we are completely outside of the organization perimeter, there is a need to have a multi-factor authentication. So having a password alone isn't sufficient. So either have an additional factor, which could be one-time password, device certificates. There are many, many ways to do that. But living on just one password could be a very dangerous thing in today's time. There are technologies which make it very easy today, but those are the things which I would say are both tactical as well as strategic measurement when we do work from home. But there's one area which I think takes center stage in today's world than it's ever taken before. Is it I can do all that which is in my control, yet things may go wrong and things could go wrong. So when that happens, we always typically in our lives turn to insurers. And now there is also a possibility for us to buy a good quality, rightly comprehensive, and an insurance cover which can take care of some of those cyber incidents which still happen beyond all the capabilities. So, David, you are the one person who I know in our global world who has great knowledge and expertise on dealing with cyber insurance as a topic, because this is one of the most confusing and less understood topic. So, would you like to kind of take us through the journey on how best to deal with cyber insurance as a subject in today's time?
You set me up for trying to simplify the topic in that case, Akhilesh. And thank you for going through the working for home stuff. I mean, there was one question I was going to ask you, but I think one of the big things for working for home for me is just the need to make the advice really, really, really simple, straightforward, and accessible on how to work securely as well. Because one thing from the clients I deal with is that they're dealing with a wide range of technology literacy. And some of the people who they've asked to work from home have no IT at all. This is the first time they've ever been given a corporate laptop, for instance. I know it sounds strange, but we've got the whole span of different skill sets. I also wondered, Akhilesh, my nightmare scenario, and it plays to cyber insurance a little, is a ransomware attack, which actually impacts people's devices at home. And I just wondered if you have any practical thoughts or advice on how people should prepare and deal with that.
I think that's a very important topic. Ransomware is a kind of technology which bad actors develop. It's a very similar situation to the physical world when people used to kidnap the loved ones, take them away, and ask for ransom in response to releasing the person. And I think the ransomware has taken the same shape in virtual world, wherein the bad actors actually take control of devices, encrypt the files, and take them away from us and ask for money. Now, unlike the physical world where kidnapping was a rather hard act to do, ransomware in digital world is a super easy thing to do. In fact, somebody with little knowledge and a gullible individual as a prey can easily do that. So we have seen the number of ransomware attacks which are code crafted go through, again, significant high potential. So number of people when they're working from home, and there are 2-3 things which kind of come to my mind right here, is that one is that the bad actors have always found the easiest thing to track, and they would always go for topical and thematic things. So right now the topical thing is that if you get an information saying, here is a vaccine for corona this person has developed, click here to know more. Or even we are seeing some of these where people have said that you want to donate it to the charity of your choice, click on this link and donate 200 rupees. In fact, so these are the kind of scenarios that we're seeing because they're just growing every single day. One which we have come across where people have crafted malicious app and saying, this is a wonderful app if you download, and of course you want to track your location, Bluetooth, and everything. And once you give all the permission, if you come into the contact of anybody who is within 3 meters of you corona infected, we will send you an alert. So switch on everything. And those are some of these rogue apps, bad things which are coming every single day. So I think one is the proliferation of that. The second is that when people are working from home, the research suggests that we are able to not differentiate work versus non-work so easily. So the ability to click on bad links is higher. And the third very important factor is the devices when they work from home context for a long time may not be as secure as they could be while they are within the enterprise network. So here is my suggestion and practical advice to everybody that one, don't be news hungry and don't be clicking on everything which comes your way, because these ransomware emails are very, very finely crafted. It is not easy to detect from a malicious email to a good email. So be very cautious and don't jump the gun. Second, if anything which asks for information, which is even could be your company asking for fill in the information about your travel history and all that, just double check before you do it, because it is highly likely that when you're giving away the information, it might be going to be bad actor. And the third one is that make sure that your devices at least have the latest antivirus, anti-malware, and all of those kind of things. And my last trick always works that something which comes to you, react a little bit slow, because you've always seen that when you're in the middle of doing multitasking, doing 5 things, don't jump into every single email which comes. I know I'm telling you a productivity non-booster. I didn't know a good word for the antonym of booster, but I'm telling you a wrong productivity hack. But I think those are 3 things in my mind.
That's great, Akhilesh. Thank you. There's some good practical advice there. So let's talk a bit about cyber insurance then. So the first point for me is it's still evolving as an insurance product. It's quite new. Really has developed over the last 5-6 years. And we've seen obviously the US lead in terms of those policies and product lines, and now that being globalized. One of the challenges with cyber insurance is it's often quite a misunderstood insurance product. And at one level, people tend to focus on, it's going to provide me with a financial compensation if I have a major cyber breach. So it might compensate me for business interruption costs. It might compensate me for the cost of the instant investigation, the forensics, the legal costs, maybe even sometimes the costs of my brand and reputation repair, and things like providing ID and fraud protection cover for my customers. And the answer is, your policies will cover you for all, or at least a majority of those cost items just now. So it's actually quite a useful product. But what's more useful often with cyber insurance is not the financial compensation piece, but the immediate specialist support it offers if there is actually a cyber incident just now. And examples of that is all of the cyber insurance firms will have instant response firms on what they call panels. So you can ring up your insurer and say, I've had a cyber incident here, I've had a ransomware, I might have had a major cyber fraud, I think anyway, or I've had a data breach. And they will all provide you with access to an instant responder very, very quickly, who'll be able to respond within hours typically. And they'll provide the initial, typically 72 hours of instant response support. And that can be quite crucial, because that's the piece which helps you contain the incident just now, take sensible steps to limit your exposure, and get you onto the first stage of thinking about business recovery, and also the forensic analysis of what's actually happened during that incident as well. And that's quite a powerful offering in an emergency. And they'll also often provide you with access to specialist legal advice just now on things like data protection issues. They'll provide you with support on brand and reputation and customer impact management as well. So when you look at cyber insurance, it's worth thinking about it not just in terms of financial cover, but also in rapid access to trusted advice you may need in time of crisis and able to mobilize quickly. And that's probably actually often the most important part of the policy. There's some downsides. Because the policies are new-ish, 5-6 years is quite new when you compare it to building contents, directors and officials, insurance lines. The terms and conditions are not standardized yet. So the brokers need to be in a position where they can advise you on which policies are right for you. And sometimes you'll need to work through some scenarios with them and say, if this really did happen to me, what going to be covered for here? And what are the exemptions and exclusions which are part of my policy? And that's an important discussion to have with your broker if you're purchasing cyber insurance. If you're a large firm, you may be having multiple cyber insurance providers in layers, as they call it, running up different levels of liability, with a primary who's your point of contact, and then secondaries who provide additional cover in blocks of, for a big bank globally, hundreds of millions in terms of liability cover. And the last point for me is, because it's a relatively new area, the cyber insurance sector is still trying to work out what its potential exposure actually is just there. So an example of that would be ransomware. Come back to that point again, that Akhilesh covered. We have seen a major increase in ransomware claims over the last 12 to 18 months across the whole insurance sector. And that's been driven by two things. Thing number one is a change in the modus operandi, the way the criminal groups work. So they're now focusing more on infecting systems, spreading the malware throughout the network, and then encrypting all the servers and all the endpoints, the PCs, at once here. And that means they can ask more in terms of ransoms just now. And that's pushed the figures up. So before it might have been a couple of bitcoins in cryptocurrency terms, maybe £3,000 or £4,000 sterling in my case. But those figures are now much higher. And we're seeing ransoms in the million category now that we would just never have seen previously, millions of dollars. And then the last twist on ransomware is we're seeing more what they call double extortion attacks now, where a criminal group will break into your systems, they will steal blocks of your data first, which is sensitive, and so they can use it to blackmail you at the same time as encrypting systems and extorting a ransom payment. So the insurance sector is beginning to adapt to this higher level of claims, and we will see some of that come through in the pricing of cyber insurance over the coming months. And like the whole insurance industry, it is having to adapt to the new COVID-19 pattern of activity and claims as well. So my takeaways on cyber insurance is It's worthwhile, definitely. It's not a substitute for good cybersecurity, but what it does give you is financial recompense for things like business interruption costs around a cyber incident. But most importantly of all, it gives you access to specialist support in a crisis who can actually help you limit the impact on your business and speed your path to recovery as well. So that's a quick run through on cyber insurance. I think the next topic we're going to chat a bit about, which we haven't covered yet in detail, was data privacy. Atul.
Thank you, David, for giving those perspectives on cyber insurance. And because the natural takeoff point for getting into data, because one of the drivers for cyber insurance has been significant data loss or say data leakage, which has been happening, and which is driving increased adoption of cyber insurance. But when it comes on to data, it has its own consequences. It has its own ways to be looked upon, and legal parlance starts coming into data in big ways. Globally, we have seen the big economies, the large economies have come up with fairly clear, stringent regulations around. And closer back in the home, in the country, we are on the anvil of coming up with the Data Privacy Act. Well, that's bringing in a whole lot of sensitivity about how data needs to be handled or how data needs to be managed going forward from here. But if we were to contextualize from the current times, when we are dealing with this uncertainty in the pandemic environment, there is a flurry of data which is being captured upon, be it as organizations, be it as enterprises. There are obligations which are coming to each one of us to capture a lot of information about our workforce. And most of the times, this information which is being captured upon gets to be part of what is called sensitive personal information or personal health information of individuals. Given this environment, given the times where we are living, and we did talk upon on the paradox between focusing on the requirements which are coming in from a safety and a security perspective or being contextualized to the current times, it's a very similar dilemma which emerges when we start looking at data privacy as a domain. But there are clear guidance which are emerging upon for enterprises and organizations to look and deal with the data privacy requirements. There has been a massive furore which got raised upon when the incident of COVID-19 spread across in the country, when there was a lot of personally identifiable information which started trending in the digital. That resulted in multiple challenges. Organizations have realized that there is a need to have practices established for ensuring there is a safe record keeping. And when information about health is being captured, that needs to be taken due diligence around how the precautionary controls are built around the data which is being captured. There is also an obligation in the current times for enterprises to share information with authorities. And that again brings in a bit of a challenge, saying what are the sources that we are using or the channels which we're using for sharing the information, because any information which goes out in a larger public medium may go back onto the data privacy principles, which every enterprise is following up as we speak at this moment. It's becoming even more complex as workforce starts operating remotely, because the nature of the data which is getting generated, they are coming around in a very, very different forms and shapes. And we haven't dealt with those situations in past. I have heard so many different organizations who, as they are planning to resume operations, partly working from home, partly looking upon what is permissible by the government authorities, are extremely concerned about the well-being of their workforce. They're extremely concerned about meeting the obligations which the government has put out to them. And there has to be a way to capture all of this information. But how do you capture that information? How do you store that information? How do you process that information? And how do you share that information is one of the areas which many enterprises is currently dealing with to ensure that data privacy norms are not challenged as they go about operating in this area. Some of the more prescriptive ways which are emerging is ensuring that there needs to be a clear accountability, which needs to be established on the data, rather than data being captured upon multiple different functions within the organizations and no one being aware of what to be protected and how to be protected. I did talk upon on sharing of the data because that's becoming now very relevant in the current times, as well as going forward from here, where there will be a requirement coming in from regulators on sharing of information and how it needs to be done in a secured format, and ensuring the data, whatever comes across, is provided in a form and shape which is good to be consumed, but still not identifiable to an individual. Otherwise, it really has its own issues and challenges around ensuring the data privacy principles being followed upon. So data privacy in the current times, while it may have not come upon initially as one of the areas to be concerned about, but as organizations are finding their ways to live with COVID-19 as a situation, it's becoming a very, very irrelevant area to be focused. And this goes along with the regulatory requirements which will be emerging, some of those which have already emerged upon, to be looked upon on how data privacy needs to be followed as we move forward from here. I think those are some of the initial thoughts and perspectives which are emerging, and we wanted to share with the audience on data privacy at this point of time. We do anticipate, we do see that there will be more guidelines which will be emerging, but till that point of time, every enterprise is required to do the diligence at their own levels to make sure that the data subject rights are rightfully being worked upon, it's being acknowledged, and there are no situations where go beyond the rights which have been provided upon to the enterprises. So that's a broad view on data privacy from current times. And as we started by saying that these are the 5 key themes which we wanted to cover upon, but if we just quickly move to the next slide, I wanted to give a view on some of the other associated challenges which the community, the CISO community, and not just them, but many other business leaders are facing at this point of time. Some of these already got covered upon as Akhilesh talked, David shared the global perspective, and we went through various elements talking about on those 5 areas. One of the foundational ones has been scalability because it's very clearly a need which has emerged upon in operating currently, saying that how can you scale in shortest period of time. There have been the views points which have been emerging upon saying how you can do more and more with less and less, because at this point of time there is a huge constraints which are coming on the resources, yet there is a need to scale up and sweat the resources to the fullest potential. And that's one of the big challenges with the business leaders and the CIOs and the CISOs are facing upon at this point of time. We did talk on the ecosystem from a supply chain perspective. And this is another key challenge which organizations need to think upon, look upon going forward from where we are, saying what kind of an ecosystem we need to have around us, which helps us to be resilient, which helps us to be providing and meeting our obligations towards our key stakeholders. So that is another element which really needs to be looked upon, again, from the business leaders, the CIOs, and so on and so forth. We talked quite a lot on incident response in the cyber insurance, which David covered upon beautifully, saying many times cyber insurance gets looked upon only from hedging off the financial impact for organization. But what we undermine is the ability to provide a response to an incident and contain upon an incident, which is again a big challenge at this point of time. We did talk on the various kind of cyber issues which are emerging, or cyber risks which are emerging either because of work from home or the attacks being launched upon by the bad actors. And at that point, given this context, having a robust incident response is again key fundamental aspect which needs to be established. Ensuring monitoring in a distributed environment where the workforce is connecting upon from multitude of devices. We talked of bring your own device. We talked take your device home. and so on and so forth, is bringing its own implications around saying how do we build upon the right monitoring practices. And the last but not the least, if the organizations have been following upon the more traditional approaches on running on on-prem kind of data centers, how are we ensuring that we're building enough resilience around those to minimize any impact because of the failures in those data centers? In today's environment, the way the businesses are operating upon, it's completely dependent on digital channels. Data center tends to be the fulcrum of running those digital channels. A lot of enterprises are looking upon this as an opportunity to make that shift from a traditional approach to a more new agile approach or a more new resilient approach, which is emerging in form of cloud-based solutions. But that's another challenge which organizations need to really look upon, go back, think through, saying how should they be looking on their immediate short-term goals as they recover from COVID-19 at this point of time. So it's not just those 5 themes which we thought will be very relevant for the audience to be covered upon today, but it's in addition to that, there are many other challenges, some of those quite intertwined within those 5 themes, and some of those which may be coming in addition to those 5 themes, which we wanted to leave with everyone. I think that really brings upon us into a right segue to get into addressing the questions. I can see there are certain questions which are emerging at this point of time, and audiences can feel free to post more questions so that those can be picked upon and they could be answered. I'll just turn it around at this point of time to Akhilesh to pick up on some of the questions, Akhilesh, which are coming at this moment, and you want to share your perspectives on those?
Thank you, Akhil. Thank you so much. Before I pick specific questions, I must say it's been a great conversation. I could go on for the other insight which we could pick up from each other. But one thing which I kind of was playing in my mind as I heard you, and also the way people are responding to this, there are certain realities which we may not have seen fully yet. And one such reality I want to talk about is many people, when I talk to, they feel extremely elated that, oh, we were so well prepared, our 95% capacity is back into work, we switched to work from home very, very easily, so life is good. Also, a lot of providers are saying, my systems are resilient, we work very well. I just want to kind of talk about one or two things which we might be oversimplifying. Number one is, in this time when we're living, we are all dealing with a fair bit of personal anxiety, challenges to health and other issues, and therefore people's empathy levels are very high. So people who are responsible for managing IT, I just want to tell you that if people are being tolerant, it is truly a short-term phenomenon. Once we get back to normal, the expectation will still be that 99.9% is not good, because that 0.1% for me was unacceptable. So I think the fact that we are relying on, we are able to operate normally and feeling good is not a real test of resilience. The second thing which I want to talk about resilience, while everybody is working from home and a lot of consumption of bandwidth and other things are happening, and a lot of people are telling me saying, see, India has a great infrastructure, thanks to 4G everywhere, we are all connected, nothing goes wrong. But we also have to see that while the Netflix of this world are peaking and so are the emails peaking, but there's so much of digital business transactions which are relatively low right now. So we are not as peak capacity as one could have. So I think it's time for us to also look at the expectation in real new world will be different, and the resilience expectation in the new world will be different. So that's really another thing which I thought was worth highlighting. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to bring it to some of the questions, unless because you want to do it differently. I picked up a few very interesting questions which are here in the chat box, as well as there were some which were raised through the registration process. So let me just start with the first one, which I'll pick up from the chat box. This is a question which says that, do you think that lots of startups, despite being tech savvy, have not considered very significant security investment, and how are they exposed? So first is, I agree in some parts with the observation, but I would not super generalized to all startups, because there are many startups which are very security conscious. In fact, there are many startups in security space itself, so they are actually propagating the importance of security, etc. But here is what I kind of say, that what matters is that the security is worth only if the underlying content or the business process is worth protecting. So we would not go and put $1 to protect a dime, because it is very important for us to understand the underlying value of the system, the data, and the process which you're trying to do. I do realize that sometimes these startups actually are more agile, and therefore their processes may not be as robust as it might be for the large enterprises and all that. And that's how people try and adopt the two-speed IT, in that sense that, the core takes a very different speed and security deployment, and then the experimentation layer and maybe the edge has a very different thing. So I would say it really depends on the underlying process, underlying data. And we have seen some examples of some companies which you would call, relatively small size company and growing company may not have prioritized as much as the large enterprises do. But David actually has a theory on this one as to, how do you learn? Sometimes you learn proactively, and sometimes you learn through an incident. So David, anything you want to kind of pick up on this one as to what do you see this world different?
So yeah, I think you're right, Akhilesh. It can be quite a mixture, and there's almost, I think, a growth point for startups or scale-ups as well. So what I tend to find, it's a generalization, is a lot of first-stage startups, which might be just heading towards sort of Series A funding, are very, very focused on, let's develop the concept, let's get initial prototypes, let's put together a first stage offering that we can try and find an anchor client for. And then as they move to grow as a startup, particularly through the Series A funding round and subsequently, which brings a bit more discipline from private equity and venture capital engagement, they're also having to stabilize and in some cases re-engineer some of the solutions they put in place at the earliest phase of their startup life as well. And that's partly when they start dealing with big clients, because we will start asking a whole series of awkward questions about the security of some of their systems and technologies as well. So I think it's a mixed picture, but in general, it plays to a little bit of the point that with small and medium-sized enterprises, often they do remain, can be quite vulnerable, because ultimately they're relying on relatively small IT teams, and there may be no cybersecurity specialist support at all within that team. Frankly, it may be a single IT manager in the early stage. So the challenge for them is getting the basics of security right in a very easy to use form, which is not going to prevent every single attack. So in the UK, for instance, we have the Cyber Essentials scheme, which is designed to be a very, very simple, lightweight certification. Costs around £200 to £300 to get an initial certificate just now, but it just does the basics around patching, antivirus, good passwords, firewalls, not much more than that. So I think it's a mixed picture, Akhilesh, and I wouldn't want to generalize that all startups are bad at security, because that's wrong, frankly. But we do see a maturity as they start growing through their funding rounds.
Thank you, Dave. I'll pick up one more question. Maybe I'll throw that to you, Atul. Very interesting question came out as, and I'll read it. I'm an HR professional and we collect employee personal data. So want to understand our role and responsibilities towards data privacy and what our suggestions should be. So we'll take that, Atul.
Oh yeah, and as you were picking that question, Akhilesh, I see some of the very relevant or related questions coming up in the Q&A panel over here as well, which are talking very similar things around data protection. So let me try giving a broad perspective so that we address some of these questions also which are coming across. Data privacy and data protection has been an area which has been constantly evolving. And we saw a massive shift coming in the world when European Union adopted a very stringent data regulation around the data privacy, which is called GDPR, went live in 2018 and has been on for a while now. There have been a lot of learnings which have emerged from that. And to that extent, the way the world has started looking upon on data is very different since GDPR came into existence. And that has triggered multiple other countries to relook on the regulations from data privacy and data protection perspective. And noticeably, it's happened across Asia Pacific. It has happened across the regions within the remaining parts of the Asia, or some parts of Africa have also gone through it, and massively North America, we have seen a shift which has come. It's not that in past data privacy was not required or the regulations were not there, but the benchmarks have really changed, or the yardsticks against which it's being looked upon now has changed quite a lot. Closer back to our country in the home in India, data privacy has been again an area which has been picked upon quite passionately. And there have been multiple views which have been coming across on the same subject. There was a view which came in from the regulators on saying how data should be managed. It was also linked to data sovereignty issue at some point of time. And there's those multiple thoughts got built upon when India came up with a data privacy bill in a draft format, which was put out for public opinion. And a lot of feedback came in. And then now the act is, or the bill is going through its own motions to get into a law or an act or a regulation. But proactively, most of the organizations who are dealing with this data and are sensitive to the information which they're dealing with, as well as looking at the good practices which are emerging, are proactively adopting the data privacy practices to be followed upon. There is an active sensitization which has happened at the senior management level, and everyone is picking upon what does really personally identifiable information really means upon. Going back to the question, Akhilesh, which you asked, HR professional, what information should, or what role should they be playing? I think extremely important role HR professionals have to play, because they deal with something which is very sensitive to every employee in the organization. In fact, HR professional doesn't deal with information only with the employees, but they also deal with prospective employees who may join the enterprise or who may not decide to join the enterprise as well. So the role of HR from a data privacy standpoint becomes extremely, extremely important. There are definite terms which really comes upon saying what would be the obligation from a data subject, which a data subject tends to be an employee, and someone who is capturing that information, and what will be the obligations which are emerging from there for the person who is capturing that information. So a whole lot of those elements come into a play, and enterprises are building their data privacy frameworks to ensure there is a right way of approaching it at this point of time. We did cover it up, and maybe I'll address one more question, because I saw that question coming upon, saying how are we picking that point in this context at this point of time? I think we picked it up because organizations are asked to capture a lot of sensitive information about workforce at this point of time, which is largely focused around health. And we need to be sensitive as we capture this information. How do we disseminate this information? If we don't do it rightfully, the, the impact which it can create on the morale, the impact which it can create on the sentiments of our workforce could be very significant. While today we are not driven or governed by a definite regulations, but it's more proactively a good practice which enterprises in India should be following upon, to make sure that as we deal with these sensitive information, we are very mindful of what we are dealing with and how are we protecting that information. I think that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Atul. Thanks, Atul. I know you gave a very comprehensive answer, but I'm now suggesting us to be a little bit brief, because we have about 5 minutes to go, and I have 26 questions already. So I'm not going to be able to devote much time. So I'll try and combine a few questions and try and answer some very quick, and some maybe I'll invite comments from David and Atul. But if you have more questions, please send in through the chat box. By the way, there are a couple of more questions came in last. So I'll take one easiest question for myself, and then I throw the tough one to David. The easiest question: that are there any insurance companies in India that provide cybersecurity insurance cover? The answer is yes. There are quite a few, and you can reach out to your insurance provider. They'll be able to point you. If they don't, please write to me and I'll be able to help you connect with that. But more important is that before you go to the cyber insurance companies, you should also know what you're looking for, because buying a cyber insurance can be quite tricky. So looking at what is good for you, because it's one of those areas where there is a fair bit of less education and maybe overselling, underselling kind of issue. So, but I think there are a lot of companies in India have started to offer this over the last 2 years. So, but let me throw the difficult question to David relating to cyber insurance, which basically says that what happens with respect to the security insurance when my systems are compromised while working from home? It could be because of my device or company device. What is covered and what can be claimed?
Okay, so there's never going to be a black and white answer, as you'd expect. But I think cyber insurance firms would be under a lot of pressure to meet claims which are associated with a sensible shift to working from home. And that would certainly cover, in my mind, corporate devices that are supplied for home working, and probably BYOD devices, which are under some form of management. So mobile device manager, for instance, or Intune. So that's, I think, would be reasonably clear cut. Where I think it gets more interesting is if you're using BYOD devices which have no corporate management of that device at all just now, and how that would apply. And I think the line the cyber insurers would probably take is, they are probably going to meet the claims given the political climate around COVID-19, unless they can demonstrate negligence, i.e. that you have not configured any security controls or measures. So an example would be BYOD devices, which, for instance, aren't using two-factor authentication when logging into a corporate portal or a cloud service. That might be regarded as a fairly poor security standard, particularly if there's no password complexity controls or requirements in place. So I think the cyber insurers may end up pushing back on claims where it's pretty clear that actually we have basically put together a home working infrastructure which is fundamentally insecure or exploitable. That's a different problem, Akhilesh.
Thank you so much, David. I'll pick a couple of super easy question and a little bit easy question, and then throw one to Atul. So there are a couple of questions saying, is there a data privacy law in India like GDPR? Is the data privacy law implemented? So the simple answer is there is no law in place right now in India equivalent to GDPR. The law in India covers, so there's an IT Act which has a section which talks about data protection, but there is a bill which is the Personal Data Protection Bill of India, which is already available, and that bill is going to go through the process of turning into a law very soon. So the answer is not a law in India at the same degree of comprehensiveness, but coming very soon. There's also a question saying that the GDPR was in comment and compliance and the implementation zone for 2 years. How much do we expect in India? Very tough for me to answer, but given where we are and the complexity requires, I would expect some timeline for implementation for different kinds of rules, because the law is not just one rule. It's talking about setting up of an authority, which I'm sure does take time. It talks about certain things. So I have a feeling that it might come into force soon, but the implementation mechanism and the machinery around that might take a little bit time for that to come in. So Atul, with those easy questions, I'm going to throw a very interesting question to you. Or let me address one more before I address you. There's a question very interesting, saying when most business leaders believe that in period of such crisis, over communication is best form of communication. What is our view from data security and privacy standpoint? So thank you for asking that question. In today's time, I would say I've always maintained that communicating to people about cybersecurity is paramount, and over communication is never enough in this area, because things are changing very fast. People change organization, so you need to over communicate. But in today's time, it is equally more important. So make sure that you continue to talk to clients about this, to your employees about this issue, but clearly do not repeat the same message in same medium over time, because people tend to shut their ears when they hear the same thing over and over again. So you need to be over communicating, but with high degree of creativity and some diversity in the channel of communication, the medium of communication, and the content. So do over communicate, but with different frequency and trend. Atul,
Yes. And I'll add a quick one to that, Akhilesh. I mean, there's also something about making sure that those cybersecurity messages are actually embedded into the core communications and narratives that go out from leadership as well. So it's not just seen as, oh, the security team is pushing cybersecurity. It's seen as we got leadership buy-in and commitment, and there's a consistency in the messaging and comms around it as well.
Great point. Great point. I think it's important. It can't be just cybersecurity for the sake of cybersecurity. There's a question, Atul, which I'm kind of putting to you. Will there be more legal costs for businesses given the data protection and security contracts will now be necessary for business with every client?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you for putting that out. There are always two sides to everything which is being looked. The first one is to assess and go through a fair bit of a viewpoint on the risk that we are exposed upon and why the regulations are emerging. And the second bit is there will be benefits if we put in the controls, but those benefits will come obviously by incurring some of those investments which we need to make. So if we look at from a short-term perspective, they tend to be looked upon more from a cost viewpoint. But the moment you start looking at it from a broader horizon, that's when you start realizing that it's not just an investment which you are making to protect upon or comply to a regulation, but how business benefits can be emerging from making those investments. I have heard multiple feedbacks in the last few weeks where a lot of the CISOs have come back around saying when they were getting challenged on putting a business case together for deployment of the various cyber technologies. Today, in the current times, all of those technologies are getting maximized, utilized. And the organizations have realized that if they were not able to put in those controls, they would have not been able to operate at that level. So that's the pragmatic way to really look upon, where yes, there will be a short-term view which will emerge upon from a legal cost increase and embracement of the newer acts which will be emerging upon. But the moment we start looking from a medium to a long term, it will definitely result into business benefits. Akhilesh, I know I wanted to be short on that one.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think Atul, this time it was super brief. I want to just pick up maybe a couple of more, and I know I'm 3 minutes over, but we'll go for 2 more for the session. David, do you want to take this one? What's the opinion on security of SaaS-based application? And what are the kind of best practices focusing on application functionality versus cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's quite a tricky one. So the reality is there's going to be a wide variation in security standards across SaaS providers just now. The larger SaaS providers tend to embed quite good security measures, right down to the basics of multi-factor authentication, proper password controls and access controls, and decent event logging. Usually because they're under contractual obligations from major clients and consumers to do so as well. And they see it as part of a mature security offering. So the larger SaaS providers will have the usual range of security certifications in place to a variety of international standards. So for those big providers, I'm often less concerned about it, and they'll have a reasonably good approach to incident handling and response and vulnerability management as well for those services. But like anything else, there is a very, very wide range of SaaS providers in the market in terms of both the type of offerings and the size of the firms offering those services as well. So unfortunately, it's in that category of buyer beware a little bit, which means you do need to look for the certifications that those firms have in place. And if you're a major consumer or you're dependent on those services, you shouldn't be afraid to ask some of the security assurance questions you need of those SaaS providers, because frankly, they're providing you with critical business services. And what we're seeing increasingly actually is communities coming together to be consistent in the questions they are asking of their key suppliers as well now. And that will actually help raise the bar for the security standards provided by those individual SaaS providers. So there's no easy answer to that one, Akhilesh, unfortunately. It's a very dynamic market.
I know, it's a tough one, but I'm seeing that the credible SaaS providers are currently investing very well on cybersecurity because they do realize that this is now cybersecurity is the core of what they deliver, and they cannot afford to have challenges in that. I'll just take one question which has.
So actually, just before you go on to the next question, just wanted to add an additional perspective. And we did cover in the talk on resilient architecture. I think one of the things which we are getting to see is a zero trust architecture really coming in place. And as more and more adoption on PaaS and SaaS really comes into play, that's an area which will naturally come in play quite significantly to bring in some of these elements or address some of these risks which are being referred upon from an application viewpoint. Just wanted to add that additional dimension to the response.
Good point, Atul. Thank you so much for coming in. I'll take two questions now, and both of them are in the very wide range of the spectrum. One question is very specific to software development companies. Another question is very general to, I think it will apply to everybody. So let me first take the one which will apply to everybody. How do we ensure that mobile transactions like internet banking are secure? I think this question applies to every single person who uses mobile for doing business financial transactions. And I would say there are several things which one can do to reduce the risk of potential hacking, cyber fraud, or losing money. First is do not save passwords. Many of the apps allow you to save your password. Don't do that, because if you save the password, it is getting saved somewhere, either in the browser or in the app or something. It's not a good idea. The second thing is that if you store anything which is like credit card information for future use or making payment and store the bank information, don't do that, because it is sometimes better to type it again than to store it, because again it gets stored somewhere and not just on your device, somewhere else on the cloud as well, and one doesn't know how they kind of get misused. Third is that before you use any app, make sure that this is the legitimate and authentic app. There are lots of mobile banking apps which are actually rogue apps. They look like from XYZ Bank, but it is actually not the XYZ Bank app. While many companies track and trace these kind of things, but we see still a whole lot of things. Fourth is don't give your phone to anybody who you don't trust, because in today's time it is very easy. Even if you give your phone to somebody who you don't trust for just 5 to 30 seconds, you can install a spyware or some kind of remote software by which they will be able to capture every single keystroke and all your credentials. And last but not the least, tougher one to do is if you can separate the device on which you do mobile banking and the device on which you get your one-time password. Because the concept of creating a one-time password is to create two separate modes of authentication, one through password and one through an SMS. But if they both land into the same device, it sometimes can be easy for hackers to compromise. And last thing which I would also say, sorry, I said the last one earlier, is when you install new apps, be very careful about the permissions you give to those apps, because there are certain apps which take permission to use your phone, messages, photo, location, etc. Those are the apps which actually are doing more than what they're required to do. And they can actually capture your screen, your photos, your SMS and all that. So it's a tricky world. One has to tread carefully, but there are some good do's and don'ts to make sure that you remain safe on the internet using apps. I'll take the second one, and that's a very interesting but very focused question. What are the best practices followed by software development companies on doing on-prem development while working from home? Now, this has been a new world which is getting created, because typically the on-prem companies doing development have followed the concept of teams working together and doing the right thing by being together, and there are steps and teams are all together, and the code gets stored in a secure library and check-ins and checkouts happen with high degree of governance. In work from home, a lot of those things change. So the first advice is that if you follow the waterfall method, you are a little bit better off in terms of governance compared to when you are on the agile development. Because when you're doing agile development, there's a lot of code change which keeps happening, and it doesn't follow the same degree of governance. So assuming you are on waterfall kind of methods, make sure that you have a secure code library. If you don't have a secure code library which can be accessed by everybody, make sure that you create the offline version. So there are really private GitHubs which are available, which allow you to kind of secure the codes, put the code. Second is start doing code signing, because when you have so much of code floating around everywhere and the work from home kind of model, the code signing allows the checksum and the ability to track if a particular code has got contaminated. So those are the two things I will say at a high level in the interest of not making it too technical. But if you're doing agile development, I think life is a little bit more complicated. And there, during the work from home environment, you have to use collaborative tools which allow you to all be on the same page and are able to build the sprints as it may be, like single sprint rather than people working in complete isolation. So those are some of these do's and don'ts which I think would come in here. Now, David and Atul, is there any particular question you want to pick up? Because I'm conscious of time, and I think we have covered most of the question, if not directly some through covering with others.
So, I mean, I might quickly pick up on, we had a question about reuse of credentials, Akhilesh, which I could cover quickly. So the concern here is people working from home end up sharing credentials, and often there's a sort of back chat on applications like WhatsApp going on in the background as well. And there is a genuine concern over this, actually, because we are quite worried about the insider threat piece of people colluding at home. And we see that on things like investment bankers and traders who are now working from home. It can be all too easy for them to swap information between themselves. Same may apply for call center workers as well. But there are some basic checks you can do around things like credential sharing. And those are mostly in the concurrent login controls. So how many people can log in using a given user ID, but also looking for unusual working patterns as well. So you might have concurrent logins overlap in time. You might have logins coming in very different time zones or working patterns or geographies. So for me, when we're dealing with this home working environment, there's a combination of education, good protective security controls, and Akhilesh has touched on a lot of those. But there's also things we need to do in the detection and monitoring space as well, to look for unusual suspect working patterns and use that part as our risk control around working from home as well. That's me, Akhilesh.
Thank you so much. Atul, anything you want to pick up as a closing comment?
No, I think it's covered quite well. There are just few more questions which are still emerging around bring your own device. And I think David covered quite well on various elements which can be looked. And I think there is a generic question saying how safe is it to approve personal laptop, desktop, or simply bring your own device? I think the definition of safe is in a context. And there are multiple ways of what can be done to make it really safe and how to operate upon using a BYOD mechanism. So I still see a lot of inquisitiveness around coming around what technologies to be deployed to make a safe environment. I think just wanted to leave the thought that technologies are here to enable us to mitigate the risk. We need to be sure of what are those risk factors that we are trying to mitigate and address upon, rather than just applying technologies. Ransomware, as David talked, has emerged as again a key risk, and there is a need to build upon the safe technologies to address it. Similarly, when it comes into bring your own devices, is it credential sharing, is it data to move out, and so on and so forth, we need to bring that risk viewpoint and then look upon what technologies can supplement to address those risks. Just wanted to make that point up.
Thank you, Atul. I think that's a great point. I just picked up one follow-up question which came to my app saying that if you don't allow permission, it will not work. Yes, it will not work, but what I would say is that don't download too many apps which you don't need, because sometimes some of the apps are rogue. But if it's a legitimate app, there's an option to allow the permission only when you use the app. So go for that rather than allowing permission forever and permission in the background. It'll save you to some degree. With that, I know how hard it is for me to stop talking because this is a subject on which we can talk, and I'm really enjoying this conversation with two of the other colleagues with whom I think it's a great intellectual learning process for me as well. But time is important, so thank you so much for all these interesting questions. it allowed us to kind of explore the subject with a little bit more detail than what we thought. With that, let me invite back Vikas for the closing comments. Vikas, you there? All right.
Thank you. My mic is.
We can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Akhilesh. Thank you, David, and thank you, Atul. It's been quite an engaging presentation and quite. Yeah. Thank you for your engaging presentation as well as well articulated issues covering around cybersecurity and data privacy. I must confess that I am not an IT person, but then I also learned some of the issues during your presentation, and I'm sure the participants also got benefited by your clear articulation and picking up some of the issues which are quite relevant to the industry as well as to the IT people who have joined in the participation. So thank you very much for your time again, and to the participants again, thank you for joining. And just to make an announcement that we have recorded the presentations as well as the uh, presentation copy will be shared with you after this webinar. So the recordings as well as the presentation will be shared with you. And if you have any further questions, please do share your questions either with the KPMG team or with CII, and we'll try to answer those questions. With this, I again thank everyone, and then this brings an end to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.